Welcome to episode 11 of the Minds Capital podcast, the show devoted to the growing world of independent sponsorship and deal-by-deal private equity. I'm Will Smith, here with my partners in Minds Capital, Nicholas James and Max Lummis. The interview you are about to hear is with Ramiro Alfaro of Guatemala. Max, what struck you from this conversation with Ramiro?
So this conversation reminded me in some ways of the conversation that you had with Nikolai Dimitrov, who was investing in Bulgaria, and Ramiro is investing primarily in Guatemala. So another emerging market, but one that's closer to home. So, he just reiterated some points that I found interesting as well in Nikolai's interview, just related to sourcing deals and, the fact that the capital markets are a lot different in Guatemala than they are in the US. Cold outreach works very well down there, where it's kind of played out here to some extent in the US. And he gave a specific anecdote of spending 5 years with a seller before they actually closed the deal. So I thought it was really interesting that how relationship driven the business development is down there. It's obviously a market that's probably way underserved from an M&A standpoint. And he seems to be pioneering, search and or independent sponsorship down there. So there's probably some good opportunities from a valuation standpoint. But you have to know the lay of the land, and you have to be willing to roll up your sleeves. Again, it helps if you have a connection to the home country and to the sort of the home culture. So that's definitely and undoubtedly a big part of it.
Yeah, of course, I was also reminded of our Nikolai interview. Ramiro made an interesting point, though, about, which I don't think I've ever heard in talking to people who are doing flavors of ETA in emerging markets, that the lack of a capital market in Guatemala, at least, means that I think he uses the word cemetery, means that businesses die because if they don't go to the children and there isn't a private equity market or searchers and sponsors buying these businesses, they just die. And I guess we do hear that in the US. It's like these businesses shouldn't just shut down. They should go to another entrepreneur, if not strategic or private equity. But I'd never heard it kind of cast in that really kind of tragic sense that without a capital market, these businesses have nowhere to go. And it's a really sad thing that a sponsor like Ramiro is kind of helping solve. So I thought that was an interesting point. What about you, Nicholas?
I like the word pioneering there for Max. One contrast I would say here, Ramiro is really well read, and he also has the perspective of the US because he spent a lot of his career and education in the United States. So he's really able to see that contrast between what it looks like in the United States and what it's like in Guatemala. And I just, as a Norwegian, continue to be really fascinated by the incredible opportunity at hand for independent sponsors outside of the United States. The market is well developed and more mature and easier to finance here in the United States. So there are some advantages by being here, but there's so much white space. I mean, there are some countries like Canada especially, and to some extent Spain, UK, Italy, where you see deal by deal activity. But when you come to a country like Guatemala, there's just like all open white space, and they need to be the ones educating participants, investors, bankers in the marketplace, and most importantly, sellers, of course. And I just have to believe that this first mover advantage they're talking about it now when they're 5, 6, 7 years in, but imagine another 10 or 20 years of being in that position, being a market leader as the go-to M&A buyout shop in the lower middle market for a geographic region.
Exactly. Yeah. It's all of the being a pioneer. It's a lot more work because you're the one tilling the soil, but you're also the one there to do the first one there to do the harvesting. So it's you hope that all that hard work means that you're rewarded. That's certainly what they're trying to do. Actually, Ramiro's partner in Paltus Capital Juan Aguilar has been on my other podcast, Acquiring Minds, and Juan had done the very first search fund. So not independent sponsorship, but search fund, just another flavor of ETA, as everyone knows. Very first search fund in Central America, I think they said. So pioneering both as independent sponsors and as search fund entrepreneurs. I'll just share my takeaway, or one of my takeaways from this conversation with Ramiro. I love the structure part of the conversation. So this episode has Nikolai vibes. It also has Nick Hashka vibes, which will have aired last week. In the Nick Hashka episode, of course, we unpack this structure that Nick spent a lot of time devising and was successful going to market with for his roll-up. Similar here, where because of the constraints of the market in Guatemala, Ramiro and his partner Juan are forced to innovate a little bit around terms and structure. And that's not to say that this structure is only relevant in kind of an immature market like Guatemala. I think actually what they've come up with could be applicable to somebody doing sponsorship in the States or elsewhere as well. But they kind of look at the menu of options from holdco to long-term to independent sponsorship to search, and they try to thread the needle of picking the best of all of that. One interesting moment he said, and one of the keys to that is they have their capital base, this group of investors they work with, is essentially like committed capital. They've essentially committed to doing deals with all of them, and the cap table from deal to deal should be mostly identical. So as Ramiro puts it, it's what does he say? It's homogeneous cap tables mimicking a holdco, so they can make these capital allocation decisions across deals. So completely different entities, but because the cap tables are identical, they can cross allocate. It's a really interesting dynamic. Shall we begin?
Go for it.
Great. Here is Ramiro Alfaro of Paltus Capital in Guatemala, episode 11 of the Minds Capital podcast. Enjoy. Welcome to Meeting of the Minds, your connection to the growing world of independent sponsors and deal-by-deal private equity. We are your hosts, Will Smith and Nicholas James. Ramiro Alfaro spent more than a decade in the U.S. at places like HBS, like BCG, before returning to his native Guatemala in 2018 to do a traditional search fund. That plan evolved into independent sponsorship and partnering with Juan Aguilar, his best friend since they were in diapers, and a former guest on Acquiring Minds. So I know Juan as well. We're going to hear more about Ramiro and Juan's first deal, an electrical products manufacturer, and how they've evolved into becoming a leading deal-by-deal private investing shop in their region, Central America. Ramiro, welcome to Meeting of the Minds.
Thank you very much. Big fan of all the work you guys do and happy to give back to the community through here.
Appreciate it, Ramiro. Well, let us begin with what I just teased, your initial plan to go back to Guatemala and do a traditional search fund, and then how that evolved into Paltus Capital. Why don't we start there? Give us that backstory.
Yes, happy to do that. So I'm originally from Guatemala, and as you mentioned in the intro, I spent more than a decade outside of home after high school, and I always had this bug of wanting to go back home. Obviously, that had to marry up with a professional path and opportunity that sort of made sense for me personally and professionally. And during business school and through my now partner Juan, I learned and deep dive really wholesomely into the search space and really got very well versed and understood what it was, and it just clicked with me in a very personal sense, from the perspective that the broader search community is a very tight knit, very collegiate. I guess that the core values of the community very much resembled my own. And I felt it was like an all-in-one package that fit well with sort of what I wanted to do after business school, which was a bit of entrepreneurship, it's a bit of operating, and the investing part, which was something that had always been of interest to me. And so as with that, at that point in time, doing search internationally I wasn't the first one to do it internationally by all means, but it was still a little bit of a leap of faith because it was still developing. So the track record of the search fund model was pretty much sort of set, and there was a lot of evidence of it working in the US, but still in the emerging markets, it was still something that was coming along. And Juan had been the first searcher in Central America. And, when I decided to do this, even though I did consider the US for quite a bit, we ended up deciding with my wife that going back to Guatemala made sense both personally and professionally. So that's how I ended up, just deciding to take the plunge into that. And specifically, I'll go into more detail probably into it later, but my search ended up being a bit longer than anticipated. There's a lot of factors that contributed to that, but one of them was COVID, which was a big disruptive force sort of to the overarching search. But it was a blessing in disguise in the sense that it allowed for a more thoughtful, thorough, and complete search activity and in an uncharted market, which led to us building a more robust and convincing thesis around the fact that there are opportunities to invest in Central America beyond just one asset that you would do with a search fund. And that eventually led to the pivoting of my search to becoming a vehicle that would allow us to do this more serially, in the sense that more than just one time with one business, which is the typical search model. And I had to spend some time sort of figuring out the right mousetrap to do what we ended up doing. And so that's how we slowly but surely pivot into the independent sponsor route.
Well, we're going to unpack the mousetrap that you guys developed because it's fascinating. But a little bit more on, I recall from a pre-call you saying that there was, that the search fund was going to be almost a test to see if the broader thesis of acquiring businesses in Central America was something that you could devote your lives to, right? Say yes. More about how that was, how you saw the search fund as kind of step one in a much longer trajectory.
Yes, surely. So, Juan and I all had been talking even before business school about the potential of private equity investing in the region. And the reason being simply we just saw no activity or no serious activity. And even though there's a lot of reasons why there's no activity, I mean, it's not just because we thought that there were things that or dynamics that we thought there was an opportunity there for us to do that. And so that was in the back of our minds. I'm going to be very candid in saying that was just like a very rudimentary, simplistic hypothesis. We were very young then and stuff. By no means it was like this like oracle sort of well thought thing. We just thought intuitively made sense. And so when we discovered the search fund model, it was like, wow, this is like micro PE. It's like super small. It fits the scale of our region, and a lot of the merits of the model itself they just seem to make sense with a specific opportunity. And we've always thought we've always had this long-term sort of thinking philosophy, and we just thought the search model bought us optionality in that if you did this and it worked, then it would buy us the optionality to then be able to do this again, right? And we thought it was a great way to test the market in a contained manner where the risk was mitigated before going and say, which would have never happened because no one would have given us money then, but like going and like raising a fund and trying to invest a lot of money, which has been tried before here in the region and not really worked out. We figured, it was a great way to test the market. So from inception, that's sort of something that was in the back of our minds.
Why hasn't it worked historically with private equity in Central America?
I would say there are two reasons that I would argue. One is I think that the more sophisticated capital pools within with private equity managers have generally not addressed this part of the world just because it's so small that it doesn't make any sense. It's sort of like the innovator's dilemma. Like it just doesn't make sense to come into this small region because it doesn't have the scale for you to deploy tremendous amounts of capital. So super sophisticated capital pools just tend not to look at this part of the market. And then separately is the market is still very rudimentary, very opaque. There's no true capital or fluid capital markets. And so if you have a standard private equity structure and capital pool, for that to work, part of the premise of a private equity fund is you can have predictable, bite-sized, homogeneous deal flow for you to deploy capital, and then have a sort of a degree of predictability of being able to exit in a very orderly and timely fashion. All private equity funds at least claim to do this in a very very continuous cadences, right? This region does not allow for that because it's not as liquid, it's not as dynamic, and you need to have patience with that. And so previous capital pools that have attempted to do this in a purely private equity play have found themselves either pressured to deploy capital, buying into the wrong opportunities, or then buying companies that didn't have a full thesis played out for exit. And so I don't want to be long-winded on that, but those are sort of the reasons for that.
And so on your own journey, on one hand, you said that the search took longer than you anticipated. But at the same time, you're saying that long search for one company to buy led me to think we should buy multiple companies. So how do those two things reconcile? Is it because you saw there are a lot of very small micro cap opportunities here, so we need to do more volume, but trying to find out one business that has 3 or 5 million of EBITDA is going to be harder? Was that kind of what happened?
Yeah. So the way I would frame it is Juan's search was a really fast search. He searched in less than, I think, 8 months. He was sitting the CEO seat. So his search was really not that deep. He validated the ability to acquire a business here, and then he very successfully operated that. But when I came to search, and it was a longer search, I had to actually really go look into all the corners and flip all the stones and see what was there in the market. And so what ended up happening is that I discovered that there were a lot of, the market was a bit deeper than we had anticipated. And all the typical characteristics that lead to the necessity for business owners to have to think about transitioning exist. Maybe not the entire full context, which is something we might get into later, but it existed. And so as I started parsing through all of these things, I realized that one, it's not that I would never do a search fund again. I'm very passionate about the model, and a lot of what we do is still searching. But I think the amount of blood, sweat, and tears that went into actually being able to map out a market here in this highly opaque sort of place, I realized that one, it was a competitive advantage in the sense that I think no one is going to spend any time and money the way we spend it just because they don't really know what it entails. And so when we realized, wow, we have all this market intelligence, there are a lot of opportunities, and what we need is something that allows us to do this patiently and with good time to find the right things that are compatible with what we're looking for. That's when it just clicked, and it was like, doing a search is great, but maybe if we are able to do this with a bit more scale. Now, granted, the one thing I will clarify is that I think, at least for now, the intention for us is not really to become this serial acquirer. I don't think we see ourselves as acquiring 50 companies in the next 10 years. I mean, things can change. We're more about the build and the buy. So I like to describe ourselves more as like an anaconda, in the sense that we eat very infrequently, but when we do, we eat well, and so we'd rather be patient, find the right opportunity. And the way we build value for us and our investors and the community and all that stuff is to building solidly within those platforms, as opposed to trying to be too acquisitive, because we don't think we're still that astute to be able to manage a portfolio of 50 companies and all of that. We rather do it.
Do you have anacondas in Guatemala?
We don't have anacondas.
Okay. I just had to ask. Well, so you mentioned innovator's dilemma earlier a little bit. And so what I'm hearing here is that nobody who has deal-making experience from, say, Mexico or the US, for them, Central America wasn't compelling because the deals are smaller, it's very opaque and hard to get data. There's a cultural proclivity against selling your company. So because of all of these reasons, everyone who has the capacity to do deals have stayed away from the market. Now, you and Juan spent quite a bit of time, blood, sweat, tears, as you say, to build up local knowledge about what the M&A landscape looks like. And so where does that leave you now, 5, 6, 7 years down the road, that you have actively been in this market, that you have built by now that nobody else has for Guatemala?
So where that leaves us today is that, again, I would hate to sound like we planned this like very Machiavellically. It's just sort of things organically played out in a certain way, in that a lot of the conversations that we initiated with business owners 6, 7, 8 years ago, a lot of those conversations were with companies or with owners that maybe were not at the right time, but we knew that, as every business, eventually time reaches a point where selling becomes a thing that makes strategic sense. And so a lot of those conversations that we initiated and that we have followed through the years, cultivating relationships, because we're very big on trust and being able to show folks that although of course we have an economic intention beyond what we're doing, we want to be fair to them and also allow them to realize a potential and capitalize on their efforts that they've been sort of building on for decades. These type of businesses, you want to make sure that they have an ability to be able to seize those moments in the right way. And so for us has been cultivating those things and planting those seeds early on in those early years are now sort of showing their own fruits, right? Some of these business owners have really appreciated the fact that we've stayed in touch with them, that we appreciate what they've built, that we've been patient into waiting when the right moment it was for them, right? And so that has led to now a lot of fruitful, and there's a lot of frothing of conversations that we have that is allowing us to have opportunities that we see now into the future to be able to acquire businesses that fit our own sort of profile and things that are very compatible with what we look for. And so that's what we do now.
So reputation compounds, brand compounds, relationship compounds. And that's what you're seeing the effects of now. So it's not necessarily intrinsic knowledge about how to do things in Guatemala. It's just that you know people there now, and more importantly, they know you.
Yeah, I love the word compounds because that's a word we use a bit even too cliche-wise internally here. But we do believe in that. I guess the way we've always thought about this, so in a long-term fashion, is that with time, if you're just putting a good faith effort into things, eventually a lot of these things just start compounding in and of itself. And to your point, relationships compound really well. Of course, we become better at what we do through just time and reps and discussions and conversations. And so all of that has built into a reputation that we're trying to really safeguard. For us, reputation is everything in this market. And when you're long-term, every single conversation you have with any owner is an opportunity, and it's not a wasted time.
Do you do that systematically? So somebody you reached out to cold for the first time in 2018, say, what has happened? Let's say they're still not ready to sell, but what has happened since 2018 in terms of your relationship building? How have you done anything programmatically with that relationship?
I would say so. I don't like to use the word programmatically because it sounds too like calculated and too like methodical, although there's a method to the madness. Relationships are human by nature. And so it's not like we're trying to be like, how many conversations we've had with an owner and all of this stuff, because I think it has to come across authentically. And we truthfully do our best to come across that way to owners, in the sense that I'm genuinely impressed and I admire what you've done. And one of the very cool things and one of those like unintended consequences of this type of job or activity is that you get to meet a lot of very interesting people. I've never built a business from scratch that generates $1 to $5 million of EBITDA. We've acquired one, but I've never built it from scratch. And hearing all these stories from people is really admirable. And so for us, it's been a lot of like that, like very being intimate with owners, learning about their journey, learning about their personal needs and stuff. And we've walked away from great deals when we just see that the personal situation of the owner doesn't really make sense to sell. And therefore, we wouldn't ever want to be in a situation where we either try to pitch someone or take advantage of someone's situation to that.
What's an example of that?
So we've had, for example, the typical examples. We've had people that have businesses that are healthy, growing, and they are in a very young part of their career. And part of their impetus for considering selling is like, wow, like maybe I could do something else, but this is still something I'm passionate about, but the money is good and maybe I should consider it. And so we like to dig deeper in those type of conversations to be like, do you really want to sell, or are you going to regret this? Because one, that has a lot of risk to even a selling conversation and a selling process, which is like very arduous, and it's always more complicated than anyone imagines. And we know how this looks like, but a lot of owners have never gone through this. And secondly, like we want to make sure that, here in our region, we want to make sure that owners are the first ones to refer us, right? Like we would love a previous owner be the one who says to another owner, guys, these guys are the real deal. Like they're going to be truthful, they're going to be fair, and they will take care of your business. And so we're very mindful of those type of things to ensure that we build the right relationships with the right folks.
Ramiro, on the compounding point and the relationships compounding over time, compounding usually implies long term, right? That's where compounding gets interesting, and it gets really interesting in the long term, but it requires long term. I would actually think, though, that on the reputation and deal flow side, that in a smaller market, you actually don't have to wait that long because there's just fewer people involved. And so you can make a splash in people who know who you are quickly. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'll just give you an example. Rafael Quinn in Panama, he and his partner bought a restaurant. And within months of closing on that deal, every restaurant owner in Panama was knocking at their door. It's a small market, word gets out, and so they, with a single deal, you can sort of establish yourselves. Is that? Do you think that that's a generalizable dynamic in smaller markets?
Yes and no. One, kudos to Rafael. I would love for people to just start calling me after we bought one business and stuff like that. I think reputation, there's like two levels of reputation. Like one is just like being known. And that's something easy to accomplish, right? And that could be done either through the wrong ways or the right ways. But I think the reputation goes a level deeper, which is like being known for being great, right? And for being someone you want to relate yourself with. And that's the one that takes time to compound. And so we're known in the market now. Like I don't think most people who would even think about maybe selling would eventually bump into our names, not because we're famous, just because there's not a lot of folks who do this here. The question then becomes like, but have we built enough of a profound and good reputation that when they hear about us, it comes not only like, oh, I've heard about these guys, but it's followed with, and these guys are the real deal. These guys are the ones you want to do business with. And that's the part that takes time because it has to go above and beyond just you saying and being well-meaning in the way you converse and are. It has to be shown through time that what you said is what you did. And that's something that we're very careful of curating on. Again, not to be calculating in all of that, but just to really show authenticity and trust to folks, because that's, for me, is the cornerstone of everything we do.
Let's hear a little bit about raising capital in a market like this, Ramiro. We're touching on a lot of the features of that, the networking, the reputation or lack thereof, a small market, and where do you get capital? Does it have to come from local investors who understand the market, or can you bring the conduit by which a U.S. investor might invest into this region? What's it look like?
Yeah, that one's a biggie to unpack. I mean, I guess the
just tell us who you raised from. How about that, and how you went about it?
Yeah. So again, a lot of what we're doing today was built upon a series of very organic steps of things that brought us here, right? And so it all started with our respective search funds, Juan's and then mine's. And I again buckle those two together because they had a lot of commonalities in the sense that our cap table was almost identical. When we raised our capital, even though there was interest from some of the newer back then institutional sort of search fund investors, we did realize that Guatemala is a very particular market. It has its own idiosyncrasies. And we felt that having investors who were local was going to make a lot more sense to fully appreciate the particularities. And I think that we had certain relationships that we had built through time, either through personal connections or just other mechanisms, just by virtue of being here, which is a small country with a small community. So we knew a lot of people that we had a very close relationship that provided a diversity of a cap table. So, within our own cap tables, we had folks who were 0 to 1 entrepreneurs, very successful. locally and had even exits and stuff. We had people who had been serial, board members and directors of large and mid-sized companies. We had people who had run multinational companies as operators, as well as people who had been doing some level of private equity investing either here or somewhere else and stuff. And so we found all those ingredients. It was a bit tough back then, although nowadays you talk search funds and everybody know what it is. Back then, a PPM meant something. You had to actually go sell the idea of a search to people who had never done it before. And that's how we thought about it. And so we've always been of the mentality that we want to make sure that we're doing business and people who we partner with are people that we have a high degree of chemistry, and there's a good connective tissue in terms of being aligned in what we're seeking out of this, and that there's trust and a good relationship built, right? And so a lot of the capital sources that we had were primarily high net worth individuals with whom we knew personally from our previous lives. And that's sort of how the search started. By virtue of having those type of relationships with people that were local and understood the market and stuff, I'm not going to say it was easy, but it was a fluid discussion when, during the later stages of my search, I came to the table with like, guys, let's think about this other opportunity. And doing a pivot like that is not easy because, like people who invest into a search fund don't necessarily look to invest in something that has all these other, dimensions. And so long story short, it was with this same group of investors that, we had built trust, and they had sort of trusted us in our capability to be able to do this with some of the evidence of the work we had done at that point in time. Juan acquiring and operating, me searching and developing this thesis, to then back us to do this again. And so that's sort of the way we narrowed it down. To answer something more with regards to like the regional dynamics around this, there is a lot of capital harboring and here in the region. Like there are large pools of capital, typically resident in high net worth individuals or family offices, and the market has started to sophisticate to even having a couple multifamily offices. There's really no institutional capital here. Most of what gets invested in this region institutionally tends to be like the IFC and these multilateral sort of banks and stuff. And so it's a market making problem, right? There is capital. I strongly believe there are opportunities, but you have this mismatch of like there's a bit of lack of sophistication. There's a bit of those that are highly sophisticated. Most people in our regions want to have their capital leave the region. I generate this locally with my own business. The dividends that I receive, I just put them out there to diversify away from these more high risk regions. And it's a little bit of like, and I think this is true with a lot of countries, not necessarily a thing about Guatemala or Latin America, but people tend to be a little bit more bearish of their home country sometimes. They're like, oh, I understand there are risks here and stuff like that. And so sometimes having people double down with their own well-deserved and earned capital and double it down here is not like the smoothest pitch. But once you're able to craft a narrative with evidence that there exists, then you have it. So to give you an example, we had a lot of conversations and a lot of hesitation and pushback on but no one has done private equity here before. Like no one has bought and sold businesses here before in a serious way. And our answer to that was, but has anybody even tried? Has anyone really bought a business here with the intention to then eventually exit it? And from inception, you have a thesis around exit. You don't just buy a business and then hope and pray that you're going to have an exit. You buy something that has an exit potential and stuff like that. And so we were a little bit like it's a chicken and the egg thing. And so we figured we might be one that starts and be the catalyst to that evolution starting. It's a big bet, and it's worked so far in the sense that we've been able to acquire these two businesses. We have evidence that it seems going to prove out, but it's still a bet, and that's the bet we're making.
I think another big advantage of when you have a geographically focused search, which you guys do being in Guatemala or Central America, another big benefit of having a geographically concentrated pool of investors is that over time, they will start to bring your deal flow.
Yep.
Is that something you've seen already?
Yes and no, in the sense that we always get ideas and theses and leads from investors. What we found is like and that's one of the discoveries. I think there was a hypothesis behind it, and people intuitively think about this, but through our search efforts, we realized that again the market is much deeper than we envisioned, and there's this whole swath of what you would call, I call it the middle market of Central America, which is like the micro market of the U.S. Like if you compare them, but there's a lot of small or medium sized business, call it somewhere in the universe of $5 to $15 million of revenues that exist that are not that well known, and so even though we had a lot of investors, all of our investors, mostly are from here and know the market. Sometimes you gravitate to the names that everybody knows, but there's this like next layer of opacity where there's a lot of companies that is incredible. They're everywhere in the sense that they're suppliers to a lot of businesses, but you never really heard of them. And you'd be surprised then to find out, wow, they're doing really well. So people here culturally, and that's a very Guatemalan thing. People are very low profile. Like people don't really talk about their fortunes or how well they're doing. They tend to keep things close to their chest. And so that makes it a bit hard to do that. But to answer your question, yes, of course, having local investors enhances our network locally, whether it be leads, but also relationships with service providers. And when you have a deal, they're able to connect you really quickly with people who know the industry well and river guides. And so that is very, very productive for the efforts.
Well, Juan, we've heard your answer just now about investors and deal flow, and some about how you build relationships with sellers over time and how it can take years. Sounds like some of these relationships started back in 2018 and are only bearing fruit now or still haven't. Anything more to say about how you generate deal flow that you think might be particular to Guatemala that wouldn't be the kind of standard stuff you'd see anywhere? Or particular to a small market that you wouldn't see in the US, say? Let me ask you this. Do sending out cold emails, does that work as one small tactic to consider? It's so ineffective in the US because small business owners are bombarded by such emails, but maybe in Guatemala, for example, they're not.
Yeah, so I was going to say, to some extent, a lot of the activities you do to create a pipeline and source, it's the same to any place, right? It's just maybe the degrees and the methods might be a bit changed. I always say, like, searching is like guerrilla warfare, particularly here. Like, I became a true, almost pseudo Bible salesman in the sense that, we were searching in the most like bespoke, rudimentary ways from like, we got to the point of desperation of going to like corporate buildings and having look at the directory and looking at who are all the businesses there and stuff like that, or using Google Maps just to go through like some of like the industrial corridors of the country and looking for like just businesses. Because again, opacity here is as an issue as compared to the US, even though in the US the microcap space is still very opaque relative to the other parts of the market. But here it's like orders of magnitude different. To your question specifically, email outreach is much more effective here than it is in the US because of the nature of the fact that it's not a common thing for you to get. And curious enough, the response rates are tremendous. And so that's part of the things that made me comfortable with searching in a much smaller market, is that even though your top funnel metrics are by definition much smaller, because it's a much shallow market in that perspective, when I compared and I benchmarked with some of my fellow searcher peers in other markets or in the US, I realized that my bottom funnel metrics were relatively similar because my conversions were really high, because a business owner here rarely gets an email of like, I'm interested in buying your business. Frankly, some of them get scared by that because, this is a part of the world where sometimes you can get extortions through that. But like once you're able to build that, to break that barrier of trust, people are very willing to talk about. And when you talk about like I admire what you've done, they like just go all out on telling you all their story and stuff. And so, to that point, it's a lot of that. And I would just complement my answer with saying that one of the things that I do see and I don't think this is particular to Guatemala, but it's with like localized searches, is that relationship building and be able to be betting more on getting intros to people and having warm intros and then being able to develop a relationship pays a lot of dividends, because when you're this local, that starts creating like your reputation, and sort of spreads out in terms of having this like network effect of stuff, as opposed to when you're doing like a US nationwide search. Like sometimes it's actually even counterproductive to try and build a relationship with every owner you meet, because they're everywhere and you cannot invest the time to follow through with that.
Actually, and Ramiro, to that point, one of the things that we see on Acquiring Minds a lot is the value of being able to meet with a owner in person quickly. And so, there's this tactic of you reach out to an owner who's interested in talking to you, and they're across the country, and you say, "Oh, I'm actually gonna be in San Diego next week. Coincidentally, why don't we get lunch?" And you're not, of course, and you just book a flight and go meet them. I'm not advocating lying to sellers, but I've heard that tactic from multiple people. Point being, it's incredible. People will move heaven and earth to try to have a sit down with a seller, because they recognize how quickly that builds rapport. In Guatemala, where Guatemala City really dominates the country, that's probably where, 50% of commerce is. I have no idea. And it's a small country geographically, quite a small country. Is this a feature where you can go have lunch or coffee or dinner with a seller in person readily, in a way that an independent sponsor in the US cannot?
100%. I mean, that's the answer. Like 100%. Like here, meeting with someone is very easy because of the logistical. It's again, small country, small city, and frankly, it was very interesting, to be honest, because I searched literally immediately pre-COVID and then during COVID. And one of the things that we were talking about earlier with the team that really fundamentally changed is I used to spend an inordinate amount of time in my car before COVID, because every owner was like, I'm not going to speak about this through the phone. So let's sit down, and it's viable to go and sit down with somebody here. And so I would be driving all over the place, which was very, very inefficient, right? Because sometimes you would go to an owner meeting and then realize like 5 minutes in that the business is completely outside of the scope. And then you have to like be very, cordial and make sure you don't be disrespectful with people with their time and stuff. But and then everything switched to virtual, and there was this thing about like virtual being so taboo or so like this stigma around, like if you have a virtual call before, it was like an informal. Nowadays, a lot of it happens virtually, so we're able to go through our process, our screening process, very efficiently. And once we know that a business has actionability, then you can meet. But meeting in person goes a long way in this trust building process, which is very central to everything deal making.
Fantastic, Ramiro. We can't go to the next topic without hearing a little bit more about, in this part of the world, an email like that sounds vaguely like extortion. What does that mean?
Well, people here, I mean, these parts of the world are much less safe than it is in the US. And it's not that people are extorting people all the time, but there are more than one story when you get a call for someone who wants to buy your business, and then it turns out it's a scam, or it's someone trying to do something not nice to you, right? And so one of the things that I did A/B test a lot and fine tune to a point where we thought it was started to work out is like the wording of the emails, the having social media presence in a way that legitimize who you were. Again, reputation building with time, and having people the facility of being able to reach out to someone to verify that you are truthful and stuff was very important. And so that's something that one of those inefficiencies of our third world countries, that you have to sort of navigate around. But it then becomes a competitive advantage, right? Because if you have a good reputation, or you have a way to communicate that builds trust quickly and people respond quickly, that makes the speed to market for you much, much better than anyone who's a new entrant, for example.
I think in the US, the link between reputation and branding is, it has a lot to do with visibility. And I never hear anyone say I need to hold back because it's a little bit too much of me in the US context. But internationally, I've heard this from multiple countries, including from my home country, Norway. My friends there, if I suggest to them, oh, you should just post more, be more visible, they will say something down the lines of everyone relevant in Norway would know who I am within a month. And within 2 months, they would all be annoyed at me and they would really start to harm my reputation. Does that resonate with how you guys have to kind of act as well?
Yes, to some extent. Yes, I mean, but I'm not sure if I would qualify this, at least from my perspective, as a country thing. Juan and I and our team in general, we've been a little bit of like, we don't need to be that public about what we do. And frankly, part of what we want to transmit to owners and to our investors and stakeholders of our business is that we do things very discreetly and we don't need to be tooting our own horn everywhere, right? And so we try to navigate this in a way that creates this level of like we are below the radar. So we particularly don't per se go out to the world screaming from the top of our bank balconies, we're looking to buy a business. Because I think the way that has worked for us is that people find out about us because we reach out to them in a way that was like more direct and stuff. And that sort of builds this thing about, oh, these guys are really doing the work to take the time to come and find me, as opposed to just being on billboards and trying to get a lot of inbound stuff. It's sort of counterintuitive because you would think from a marketing perspective, you want to be everywhere and stuff like that. But again, it's a bit more of like, let's try to build a brand around the grapevine as opposed to being in headliners, just because I think that being a headliner is a bit more accessible and the barriers to entry to that is less. And in this type of business where trust is a big part of it, you want to make sure that people feel like we're not just this like marketing ploy. We're truthfully looking to meet you, right?
No, it's how you're positioning yourselves and you're really thoughtful about it. And it's obviously important. And Ramiro, we have a couple big topics we want to hear about your deal. And we also, of course, want to hear about this pivot from traditional search fund to the structure that you guys have developed. But one important topic before we get to those that you shared with us on the pre-call is how there's a bit of a stigma around selling your business among owners. So in a market, in a smaller market, a less developed market, the idea of just transacting your business is not well known. And in fact, if you sell your business, it's because it's in distress. It's kind of the shorthand reputation. Maybe elaborate on that and then how you guys have to educate. And now your role is partly to educate against that stigma.
Yeah. So I think it goes back to what we were talking about, and I think connects a lot of the themes that we covered on just there's some cultural elements and dynamics that lead to sort of that situation, which is, again, small business exists here as it does in any other place in the world. Every owner faces a situation where eventually they reach a point in time where they need to think about what happens next, whatever shape or form that takes, right? What happens here is that you lack, as I mentioned before, you lack the retirement culture, both from a structural perspective, like there's like, it's not a thing where you have here a good pension system and stuff that people actually retire and just go and fish. Secondly, there's a cultural element to it where like you just continue working. And I think to some extent people see it as, and some business owners see some form of ego, and there's like this identity attachment to their businesses, and there's a bit more romantic, emotional intricacies between you and your business. And so what ends up happening is that my experience has been that most owners here, although no one is scared of money, is just that there's this thing about like, captain sinks with their boats. I keep saying that phrase over and over again because it feels that way. Like people are like, I'm going to die with this, and then my kids or someone else will figure it out. I haven't really giving it too much thought. And so what happens is like when you reach out to owners, again, given, as I mentioned, people here tend to be very low profile. There's not a dynamic capital market. And so, frankly, people have heard of a business getting sold in the news, or they hear this about it in the US or something like that. But like, you don't hear a lot of like firsthand stories of like someone selling their business. And so it's this very like there's a lot of mystique around this. And typically when you hear someone sold their business, there's this thing like, oh, it's because it was doing poorly. Like you sold it because you gave up, right? It's something to that tune. And so people here lack sometimes due to the fact that there's no activity. So I don't put the blame entirely on them. And then secondly, just out of ignorance, I think that they go through time and the strategic alternative of selling is not something that ever crosses their mind. Even if they're not ready to do it, it's not even something they think about it. And so when you arrive and have a conversation with an owner about selling their business, 9 times out of 10, the first reaction is like, what? Like, are you like, they haven't even, it's just like, it's a complete out of the blue sort of discussion. And so what that means is that from a proprietary standpoint, which is mostly our channel of sourcing, you need to educate and help owners and give them time to navigate the psychological, emotional, and the personal process of deciding that selling their business is not only the right business decision, but is the right personal decision. And that takes time. And it's unfortunate because, and this is where a lot of, again, we of course have an economic incentive to do what we do and all of that. But to me, it's very sad to see how the lack of a capital market has this like true profound consequences on business owners here, where if you don't have liquidity and you don't know that this avenue exists, I always tell owners there's this like huge invisible cemetery of businesses that no one sees because a business is invisible by definition, but that die off every single time an owner dies and they did not think about a transition. And they tend to create either a problem for the business and a lot of wealth destruction, or even family destruction with, sort of giving a business away that has no protocols, governance around to sustain that. And so for us, we take it very, very close to our chest or feel very profound on like, we are also providing a service to owners, right? To like, we give you a path to be able to crystallize your efforts and then have a more smooth sort of process of transitioning your wealth to the second generation and stuff like that. And so it just takes time. So that how this manifests itself in the tactical ways is just that, again, like I mentioned, we have conversations with owners that 3 or 4 or 5 years down the line say, Ramiro, I'm ready. I thought about it. I realized I had a health scare. My kids just came directly and said, I don't want this business. And then that comes to light. And we position ourselves to be the first ones that come, not because we've been someone who's been pestering them with having them sell your business, but because they feel that we're someone they can trust in that process.
Ramiro, I'm just getting the feeling here of what you guys are doing in Guatemala, that this is definitely going to be a story of kind of first mover advantage. You're pioneering, which with all the bad that entails, doing the hard work, laying groundwork, educating the market, and so on. But assuming you can really start to be the market maker, to use your turn of phrase, you'll be so positioned. You'll be so well positioned you'll be the leaders doing this, and you'll be the go-to buyers of businesses if you can just keep at it and build something here. I mean, you're really it feels like a story of kind of first mover advantage being written. Let's pivot to the structure here because it's pretty interesting, and I'm not even sure it is particular to a small market. I think anybody around the world can learn from this, the structure that you and Juan landed on. So you did your traditional search fund, you'd raised from local investors, you pivoted the concept, you took that back to the investors. What did you pivot into? How did it evolve? Break that down for us.
I'll make it short and sweet in terms of how we pivoted and then what we landed and how we landed on what we landed. Because when I was about to close on my search, because we wanted to pivot into this model, to be honest with you, we really didn't have all the answers of what this was going to look like. But one thing I learned through time and just learning and stuff is, we had to make sure that capital was aligned with the strategy and was aligned with our own professional and personal desires and objectives, right? So everything needs to make sense for something to work out. And so the way we pitched investors at that point in time is, guys, We just see a lot of opportunity. Give us time to just figure out the right mousetrap to go do this. And so with the trust that entailed, they sort of believed in us and gave us the breathing room to figure that out. And we spent an inordinate amount of time really thinking through the implications of the different models. And of course, the default sort of structures that we initially went to was like, let's raise a private equity fund. As I described earlier, we realized that it wasn't fit to the local dynamics. It wasn't a fit to our investors. It wasn't a fit to our own personal preferences, right? And so we didn't want to feel the pressure of deploying capital and stuff like that. And we wanted to be more patient around those things. And so that didn't work out. And so we then spent a lot of time given our sort of long-term personal philosophy on things and, our Buffett-esque sort of side, as cliche as that sounds in this world, we started gravitating to something more akin to like a holdco. And the appeal to that was like, let's create something that is like more permanent, that lasts much longer, and that alleviates a lot of these like weird short-term incentives that sometimes managers and then investors have when you put the wrong mousing for this. And we wanted something that gave us a lot of breathing room. And we realized that long-term for us wasn't just this romantic mathematical thing about compounding and all these things you hear about, Buffett talks, if you put an Excel and just compound and just look how things compound forever, it's math. It's going to produce a really big number, right? But to us, it was more about optionality and making sure we were doing things in the way that we felt comfortable with, which is like building sustainable, like lasting value in whatever we invested and then operated, right? And so with that, we came to grasp that a lot of the holdco space, which now has become a bit more frothy and stuff, there were a lot of things that made sense academically or in theory, but at least for our own particular path, just didn't mesh quite well, both for Juan and I as managers and our team, but also for our investors. And one of the things that came to mind a lot with these like long-term hold periods and this permanent capital vehicles and holding companies is like liquidity. It's like the number one question. And how do you manage liquidity, right? Because even though you can have investors that express the intent of having a long-term investment horizon, long-term means different to a lot of different people. 5 years can be a very long-term for some people. 20 years can be short-term for others, right? And so it's a matter of that. And then you start realizing, because we have more than a couple investors, that even though everybody had expressed in spirit a long-term mindset and capital building and wealth compounding, when you really dissected that, long-term meant different things to everybody. And so instead of realizing that solving for liquidity and some other particularities around the structures of that, we realized, look, if we do a holdco, it would feel highly mimetic. Like we're just copying what has been working, but we're solving a short-term problem with, or we're having putting a long-term solution to a short-term problem, and then you're gonna have a problem in the long term, right? And so we started thinking about ways to circumvent and fix some of the nuggets that would fit to us. And again, I don't claim that we have discovered something new, or I don't claim that what we did is like the way everybody should do things. It's just something that we figured worked for us. And so that's how we landed in this like pseudo-independent sponsor model. And it's like pseudo-independent sponsor because to some extent, a search fund is like a independent sponsor model with some, features to it. An independent sponsor just means that you don't have like committed capital and you go deal by deal. But in our sense, we did craft a strategy or a structure that has the inherent flexibilities of an independent sponsor, but around certain things that we felt were going to be constants throughout the strategy into the future. And so one of them was capital. Even though it's deal by deal and our investors have the right of first refusal and to not participate if they don't want to, we have built this cohesive group of investors that in spirit works as a pseudo committed capital. Like I think the fundraising is not as onerous and as frictionful as it would be from just going out to market, because these are people who have been following us for quite some time in all of the projects that we've undergone, trust us, are aligned with the vision, and I think they not investing would be more a product of truthfully not believing in the opportunity or having some personal situation they need to attend to that would just not allow them to invest in that specific
And so
opportunity.
among that group, Ramiro, do they typically invest the same amount in every opportunity you bring them, or are they, a little bit variable in terms of check size?
As of right now, it's been a bit variable. Our intent moving forward is to keep that as homogeneous as possible, recognizing that there's not going to be a perfect way to size that, because again, part of the flexibility we bought ourselves by not doing this through a fund, for example, is that as an independent sponsor, we have a lot of degrees of freedom in terms of, like, for example, the size of the business that we can acquire. There's a thesis we have in terms of size, but like it's buying a $1 million EBITDA business to an $80 million EBITDA business is a dramatic different equity check size, right? And so that then leads to other implications in terms of how much each investor invests. But the intention of keep that commonality is, one, we do prefer to do this with a close knit of investors and people that we feel very strongly about in terms of our relationship and our friendship that we have with them, because I think it's evolved to becoming a friendship beyond just an LP base. And, adding too many more people to this creates more friction and exposes to more complexities. And secondly is because part of what we wanted to solve as well is being able to, once we have more than a couple of businesses out in the market, if we have semi-homogeneous cap tables, it gives you flexibility to be able to capture certain synergies across them, to be able to pursue certain capital allocation decisions more cohesively, sort of like you do with a holding company, but without having that rigid internal capital allocation structure. And that's sort of how we solve for that.
And so an example of that would be if you had the exact same ownership table in two different portfolio companies, you could make a strategic argument that, hey, we're going to pull $500,000 from this company of cash in order to support the other company because we have a strategic undertaking here. And you view it more as, a holdco from that perspective, versus if you have entirely separate ownership tables in the two companies, you can't pursue that strategy. That would be a big breach of fiduciary duties.
100%. And I would add to that, for example, other things that we would like to pursue, and we start seeing now opportunities to do that with the two companies that we now have, is there's a lot of operational synergies, creating like a procurement center, right? And consolidating some of those things and having homogeneous cap tables alleviates a lot of conflicts of interest to be able to create arm's length JVs, because these are not homogeneous, like these are not under the same umbrella, but ways that you can collaborate for the better of the businesses, right? And so there's a lot of ways that having that homogeneous cap table enhances what you can do and sort of mimic what you could do with a holding company. And then the last thing we were trying to solve for as well was that the structure of the investments had a casing that in each investment allowed us to be long-term in the way we conduct ourselves, both in underwriting the investment and then the operation and value creation into the future. And so what we did is that we created, we landed on this thing where, like, what does long-term mean, right? And we figured, something in the universe between 10 to 15 years is long-term enough that it buys you optionality, but it does provide some finite window to investors that gives them peace with the fact that I just didn't lock up capital for the end of time, right? And so our structure is sort of, each investment has a term length of 12 plus 2 years. So it's up until 14 years. And that sort of solved the part of us feeling, let's have the optionality of a long-term hold. I want to make emphasis that for us, it's not like this, again, dogmatic long-term hold thing of like, we just want to be long-term hold because we want to be long-term hold. If someone comes by and wants to buy the business for godly amounts of money in 2 years, and it makes it's a good economic, rational decision, we would sell the business in 2 years. We'd have no qualms about that. It's just we wanted to make sure that we're not pressured to crystallize an exit sooner, rather if we felt there was an opportunity to create value and compound capital for longer.
That reminds me of the old saying that we're all prostitutes, we just have different prices.
Yeah, exactly. Or we're always business sellers. It just matters at the right price at the right time, right?
Right.
So deal by deal, same investor pool who basically said, guys, we support you. We're expecting, unless we really don't like an opportunity you bring us, we're basically going to stroke checks into all your deals. So you can go to sellers and say, okay, we're not sitting on dry powder, but we have these these investors that are ready to put money into a deal very quickly. We've done deals with them before, but all the deals, all the businesses are independent deals. But you can cross-pollinate and look for synergies and move capital around between them, because the cap table from deal to deal, from business to business, is basically close to identical every time.
Correct.
Really interesting. With a hold period, a target hold period of 12 plus 2 years.
Correct.
Great. And to be clear about my earlier point, this nothing in there felt like it was specific to Guatemala or a small market. This feels like it could be adaptable to any market, really. Was there anything specific to your home market that shaped how you guys arrived at this model?
Yeah, so I agree with your statement that this could work in a lot of places, assuming the right ingredients are there. It's not unique to here. But there definitely were certain things that were local in nature that provided a feedback to doing this. So again, like I mentioned, like the structure landed where it was based on trying to balance, how do we balance the capital side, the opportunity, and the thesis, which is in the local vicinity by nature, and then the manager side, right? And so from that, the things that sort of were great feedback loops to landing on this structure were some of the things that I touched on earlier in the conversation. One is the opportunities that exist in the market are not as homogeneous as we would like. So like if you have a fund, you can't be investing $1 million in one company and then $10 million in another, because you would have like a really unbalanced portfolio, right? Or maybe you can, but it's not part of like a typical fund structure or deployment. Here, the opportunities that we're seeing are very different in sizes, for example. And so we didn't want to be hampered on like, oh, I can't invest in this great opportunity just because it's too small or too large. So having an independent sponsor model allows you to have complete flexibility as to what to address. And in the market here, that's something that it's definitely a competitive advantage. Secondly, was the long-term nature also was part of a structural dynamic locally here, which is exits here are harder to achieve just because it's much more liquid. We don't think it's impossible, and we definitely buy every single business with a very clear thesis of exits. As with every thesis, it's a bet, so it's not necessarily a guarantee. But we believe that long-term provides you the ability to be able to sort of have more optionality as to who and to when to sell in a market that's not as dynamic. And if you were counting on and you have an entire structure that has incentives that you would have to do a flip of a company in 1 to 3 years, I wouldn't bet on that locally here, because I cannot guarantee I'm going to have an exit in 3 years for those same reasons. And so those type of things were some of the local dynamics that really did play into this. And lastly is just the deal flow. So we're very comfortable in the fact that we're going to be able to acquire a decent amount of companies. Again, as I mentioned, we don't see ourselves as serial acquirers. We see more as builders. But I don't know if it's going to happen 3 of them in 1 year or 3 of them in the next 5 years. And I want to be comfortable with it being the latter and not feeling pressured or having an issue otherwise.
Great. Thanks for the recap, Ramiro. Great.
What about, if I could just ask quickly, we talked about the equity side, right, of financing a deal. What about the debt side? Did you have any issues there that would not be common elsewhere?
So yes and no. I wouldn't call that an issue. I think it's something very benign and, again, unique about Guatemala specifically in this case. And I say it's different because it's very different from the rest of Latin America, where we have also experience investing in. There's good access to bank debt here in Guatemala. And so the investments we've made so far have been pure play leverage buyouts, very similar to what you would see in the US, with capital costs that is very, very attractive. And it's due to the local dynamics and the macroeconomic profile and dynamics of Guatemala itself that has lent to that. So we are very lucky in that we have access to debt. Now, granted, it's still Guatemala, it's still a third world country. The banking system is very rigid, old school, and very, very rigid. But one of the blessings in disguise of that is that a lot of the banking dynamics is born out of like good banking relationships, and we have very intimate banking relationships with the core banks here. They know of us, they know what we're doing, they know our investors, so there's a very strong ties to that. And so we're able to get good financing for the opportunities in similar underwriting styles, at least in terms of parameters and sizes that you would get in the US. So that's something very benign of Guatemala, which you don't have that luxury in other parts of the world.
You mean the relationship building, that a lot of accounts based on the warm intro you get and the relationship that you build with them over time. And so they're willing to look at special situations versus in the US, it either works for their model or it doesn't.
Exactly. You still have to work with the model and that stuff, but like the point is like the differentiator between getting a good loan structure, good interest rate, and all that stuff. Even there's some questions around the specific opportunity. Is a world of a difference if you have a relationship with the bank itself and the people at the bank. And so, for example, we don't have the need for like personal guarantees in particular because they underwrite the cash flow of the business, but also they know the entire equity group and underwrite those business reputations that exist within the group and the one that we've also been building within time.
Ramiro, we want to hear about your deal before we let you go. So you're the first acquisition, and only to this point, although Juan did his own deal as a searcher,
Yep.
But as Paltus, the name of your group, tell us about the Paltus acquisition, and maybe start with how'd you find it? So let's bring some of this abstract conversation down to a concrete example.
Yeah, and I think it's a good story again to be instructive to your audience in the sense that what you're going to hear in the story is it brings all the ingredients of what we've been talking about, the local dynamics of the market and stuff. But so this business I found in late 2018, a very couple months into my search. We've always had this very strong thesis around the construction and building materials industry, just because in this part of the world, urbanization trends are really, really strong and are going to play out for a long period. And so that's sort of where the door company thesis came to be in this one as well. And so within the building materials, we found this company. It's a manufacturer of electrical products. In particular, they do the residential switchboards. And it was one of those particular instances where I reached out through email, and the current CEO and part owner of the business immediately responded. It was like an email that got a 5-minute reply, offering phone and a call. And I was actually surprised by that. And so I immediately called him, and he was, and he is to this day, he's such one of the nicest persons that I've met. And he was like, if someone's interested in learning about our business, I have no issues with you coming and looking at this. We love showcasing what we do because we're really proud of what we're doing here. And so I got an owner meeting literally the next day. I drove to the facility, the manufacturing facility. He gave me a tour. He explained everything about the business, even before I had even expressed a concrete sort of proposal on acquiring. And I then got into that conversation, and that, I got the typical response that we always get, which is, wow, I had never even heard of the possibility of doing that. And I hadn't even thought about that. The owner, the company was owned by, at that point in time, 3 main stakeholders. The company was originally founded by 2 co-founders. One of them passed away. I mean, the business is almost 60 years old, so this was a long time ago. But the main founder passed away, and his wife actually left the country and had been living away for decades abroad, and so she was just a very passive, shareholder of the business. The other founder eventually also passed away and gave it to his kids, and one of his sons was the one that oversaw sort of it from an investing perspective. And then the CEO was granted a couple of shares to run the business. And so they had 3 shareholders, but they all were in what we would call, age of thinking of what to do next. It was reaching that point in time. And only one of them, which was the CEO, was the one who was actually operationally involved with the business. The rest were really not there. And so when I understood the situation, I knew it was like the perfect match in terms of like, if they really understand that they're in very short term. In the short term, they're going to have a conversation of like, what are you going to do with the company, right? And so we had conversations there, and we left it at that. And the story just culminated with a lot of iterations of them asking a lot of questions, and that lasted for almost a year before we actually got into submitting sort of an offer for the business. And we were not getting into alignment with pricing at that point in time and stuff. Part of it was because they were really scared. They really were like, this was like something they did not understand at all.
So how big was the business, and how did you go about valuing it? So what did you know was too big of a price?
So the business was around, I think at that point in time, it was selling around like $7 to $8 million. And it had a history of being just, it was just like this, it was like a bond-like investment. It was just like so constant, producing, a constant amount of cash flow that was very, very useful for them in the way they were managing the business. And so to me, I saw opportunities to grow, but it was hard to bet on a lot of growth if you just saw a business that was like not declining, but it was not growing either. And they had a lot of dynamics that were happening at that point in time, supplier changes and some business model tweaks they were having that made it a little bit iffy for me to like go all gongos on it on price. And so that's where a lot of the discussion went around, and they had a particular financial advisor that had helped them sort of value the business through more rudimentary schemes, and that sort of biased a lot of the conversations from their perspective. And that led to us having a discussion sort of January, February of 2020, and then COVID hit. And obviously everything unraveled because they were like, man, we can't, like, we had to sort of attend home and make sure that things are working out with the business, and we just can't think about selling right now. And that lasted for almost 2 years. And then we reconvened almost, we talked a couple times in between, but then we reconvened almost 5 years after we had spoken the first time. And at that point in time, the business had grown to almost, $10-ish million in revenues. And I think given that they had a very clear amount that they felt the business was going to be worth, with the growth, it made more sense at that point in time for us. And that's when we engaged, and we realized very quickly, given what they at that point in time, they had become a bit more well-versed in what at least they believed the company was worth, and they could articulate it more concretely. And so when we got that articulation, it was like, well, now we have an asking price, and we realized that at that price, that would make more sense for us. And it was more meeting of the middle. And that's when things started, and we got into it. It was a very long deal, for better or for worse. We started conversations.
That was 4 years. 4 years, you said?
I mean, 4 years in conversations, but the actual deal from when we signed an LOI and closed the deal, it took us a year. Okay. And the reason was we had some issues with some things related to the real estate, which they didn't own. And trying to figure that part out prolonged the process, but we eventually closed the deal. And yeah, so that was sort of the story. 5 years in the making.
So 2018, you said there at the beginning that when you emailed him, he replied within 5 minutes, and then you immediately called him. And I was just thinking, that's so 2018. If anyone immediately called me now after an email, it would be really awkward at 2025. Yeah. But I think also a lot of people underestimate what you're saying there, which is a company can grow into the desired valuation. So if you have the time to sit and wait, and I've seen this play out myself, someone will say, I want 10 million. And I'll say, I can pay you that, but not today. But at your current trajectory, why don't we revisit in 6, 12, 18 months, whatever that looks like, and see where you're at? Because I think we might be able to get there relatively soon. And then, of course, I always propose an earn-out on the back end if they want action right away. But businesses grow, if nothing else, because of inflation, right? So in this case, you said it went from about 7 to 10 million of revenue during that time. And what were the margins on it?
So it was around, it went from like 1 and almost, I forget, I think it was almost $1 to almost $2 million in EBITDA when it was at the $7 or $8 million level of revenues, and then it grew into like a 3-ish, 3.5.
Okay, so the EBITDA had grown a lot more actually, and then you were able to say, okay, the number that you had specified. What was it that they wanted? Can you share that?
Yeah, I don't really recall, but I think originally it was something in the universe of like it played out to be somewhere in the universe of like 8 times or something. And
Initially.
we usually pay very, very standard terms for these type of businesses, which always land in somewhere between 4 and 6, depending on what it is and how you structure that.
Yeah.
And so with the growth, we were able to fall into that range that made sense for both of us.
Yeah. And then in terms of the deal structure, because it was the first deal and your lending and equity relationships aren't necessarily solidified yet, was it more backloaded, meaning the cash component wasn't that high, or how was the sources and uses?
Yeah, so we always think very, very deeply into structuring, and this comes very much inspired by just like the search fund world, and then thinking through how do you mitigate risk through structure. And so in this case, the business had a couple things and a couple of risks that we were trying to mitigate through that structure. One was the business had grown, as you saw, a lot, but it was sort of like a hockey stick growth. And so given that we had the door business on the other side, we knew that that industry had this like sort of bullwhip effects, given like some supply chain dynamics, and we were afraid that part of the growth was just like a catching up to demand due to the COVID disruptions and supply chains and stuff. And we wanted to make sure that we were buying at the high, and then we had some sort of reversion to the mean. And so an earnout was going to be necessary to make sure that if the growth continued, we would more than happy to pay the full price. But things readjusted, that we were going to be able to have some sort of mechanism to protect the investment. That was one. And then the other big one was this real estate component, which was by virtue, in very simple terms, the real estate where they were at is not theirs, and we had to get approval from the previous owner, the owner of the real estate to get a long-term lease, because it's very risky to go into a manufacturing sort of deal and not have like some sort of security and visibility in terms of your facility to manufacture. And so the two big structuring elements were an earnout coupled with a contingent sort of seller note that was based on certain conditions around the real estate, on us being able to have either a long-term contract or lease before a certain time period, or we did not have a necessity to move the facility as a result of this lack of visibility in terms of a contract. And so it ended up being that loosely like 45% of the business had these like contingent sort of elements as a result of that. As things trail now, we would likely pay the full price, just because things on those two elements have at least as of now sort of transpired positively, and nothing gives us more happiness and joy than to pay out those things, because we're not here to play Bugs Bunny with the owners. We're just looking to make sure that if there's a risk, that we can mitigate it, and if it's mitigated, then we're happy to pay the fully loaded price.
Great, Ramiro. We've covered a lot of ground here. We're well over time, so we got to let you go. Did you have anything that you wanted to say that we didn't give you a chance to?
From my end, not anything in particular. I'm always happy to talk about all of these things, because I think a lot of the scar tissue that comes from a lot of these experiences is always instructive, because a lot of entrepreneurs who are doing this it's learned by experience and less by just hearing people. But sometimes just hearing people face some of these experiences is always instructive. The last thing I'll mention is that beyond our activities now as an independent sponsor, or with this like structure locally here in Central America, we slowly migrated from a role of search fund entrepreneurs to search fund investors. So we also have a vehicle through which we now invest and support aspiring, search entrepreneurs and to some extent be able to share some of our experiences leading to search funds and now having this modality and helping them out. And so we have those two things, which I think is something useful to know also from our profile. But beyond that, if there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Great, Ramiro. And so if anyone wants to reach out on any of the above, LinkedIn
is a great way to reach out to me. Yes.
And what is Paltus's URL? Paltus Capital.
PaltusCapital.com.
Fantastic. Great interview, Ramiro. Fascinating evolution and story and peek into the Guatemalan market. As I said, I think you and Juan are positioned to really make a name for yourself there. So it's pretty exciting. We'll have to get an update from you in a year or two. So thanks a lot for coming on Meeting of the Minds.
I appreciate that, Will and Nicholas. Great being here and sharing some of these experiences. Appreciate it.
Hope you enjoyed that interview. For more like it, subscribe to Meeting of the Minds wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also watch us on YouTube. And check out Minds Capital, where Nicholas and I are partners alongside Max Lummis. Minds Capital invests equity in independent sponsored deals. So if you're a sponsor with a deal under LOI, please visit mindscapital.co to start a conversation. There's also an investor tab on our website with information about partnership opportunities and future fundraises. See you in the next episode.